Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us is the Pulitzer Prize winning author, Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum has written a fascinating new book entitled The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. In the book, she examines the rash of authoritarian regimes in Europe, Asia, and indeed the United States. We're pleased to have Anne Applebaum on the program. Anne, congratulations on your book, Twilight of Democracy. It really was a thrilling book to read. And you write about the rash of authoritarianism, particularly in Europe, in countries that are nominally democratic. Now, what explains the presence of authoritarianism in democratically elected regimes?
So first of all, thank you. The book is about Europe, although it is also about the United States. Look, one of the arguments of the book is that the impulse towards authoritarianism and the appeal of authoritarianism is eternal. It exists in all of our societies. There are people who are gifted at evoking it and who seek to do so. There are people who are annoyed and bothered by the cacophony of democratic discourse and dislike it. There are people who have come to distrust and dislike their political systems, including ours in the United States, as we've seen pretty obviously over the last few weeks. And the desire for something different and simpler and more centralized remains everywhere. And the book shows how that desire has played itself out in several different countries over the past few years.
Now, of course, the crown jewel of democracy are free and fair elections. And you have in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, and Hungary, the Fidesz Party, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. And in India, you have an authoritarian regime freely elected. Now, people go and vote, but why do they vote for a regime? Is it that it turns authoritarianism after it's in power, or is it authoritarian from the beginning?
So I think it's a mistake to imagine that there's a harsh line between authoritarianism on the one hand and democracy on the other. I mean, the four parties that you've just mentioned are all parties that seek to compete in some ways it depends on the country. There's different systems in each country. More or less democratically, they run elections. In some cases, those are fair elections. In some places, less so. For example, I don't think Hungary has fair elections anymore, but Poland still does, for example. And what you're talking about are political parties that have become authoritarian leaning, or which, once they gain power, seek to undo elements of democracy. So they seek to undermine the independence of the courts, or they seek to undermine the independence of the media, or they seek to change the rules so that they can stay in power, and so that they won't be expelled from power. And look, why people vote for those parties, although that's not the topic of my book. My subject is not voting and mass politics, but the reason why people vote for the parties initially can vary a great deal. They can be sick of previous governments. They can feel distrustful of the political system. They can find the appeals to nationalism and to nostalgia very strong. But what makes these parties different from other political parties in democracy, as I said, is what they do once they take office and the changes that they begin to make. And then the question is, after you have a populist authoritarian party in power, can you have a free election after that? And the answer is, in some places you can, in some places you can't. I don't want to generalize.
Look for a moment at Belarus. In Belarus, you had a rigged election, and the loser, Lukashenko, seized power. Now he wants to perhaps relinquish power because he recognizes there have been months and months of protest among people who are seeking reform. Even Putin thinks he ought to reform his government.
So Belarus is a completely different case, and Belarus has not been a democracy for a couple of decades, and Lukashenko has been in power for many years. And they don't have free elections in Belarus. There is no free media. There are no independent courts. All the elements of what you would call a democratic society don't exist there. So Belarus is not an example of a declining democracy. It's rather a dictatorship where people are beginning to protest against the system. And what you had last summer was an election that was clearly rigged, and in many obvious ways. And after Lukashenko, who has been, as I said, has been the dictator for many years, lost, he put pressure on the opposition, and he chased his most important opponent out of the country. Her husband is in prison, Tsikhanouskaya, and she is now abroad. She's in Lithuania. So this is a case of, it's not just issue of democratic decline. It's a dictatorship trying to stay in power. What has been amazing in Belarus, and is really a lesson for all of us, and should really impress all of us, including us in the United States, is the consistency with which Belarusians have nevertheless continued to protest. They come out every week. They get beaten up. They get arrested. A couple of protesters have been killed, and yet people come out every week. There's a pensioners march every Monday. Older people march even in their own neighborhoods if they're blocked from going into the center of town. And this constant demonstration of protest has taken its toll on Lukashenko, who's now beginning to say maybe he'll leave. And because Belarus is not an entirely independent country, it's dependent in many ways, economically and otherwise, and for security, on Russia. It may be that the Russian dictator, in turn, wants to change the system in Belarus because, the protest may give his own people ideas. The Russians can also, Russian is the main language of Belarus, the most commonly spoken language, and Russians in Russia have also followed the events there very carefully. So you may see with the help of Putin, you may see a change of power, but to be clear, that's not a change of power that's come about through a democratic process or through a legal ruling. It will come about through economic pressure from Belarus's neighbor. But what should be remarkable for all of us who live in safe and long-standing democracies is the risks that ordinary people are willing to take just to have a free election, just to be able to have an election where their votes count. As I said, they go out every day, every week. They go out in the snow, in the rain. They go out even though they're beaten up, even though they're tear gassed, and they continue showing up every week. It's really something remarkable.
What about in the United States, where we had a free and fair election? Yet Trump believes the election was rigged, and his Republican enablers, who really have nothing to lose by agreeing there was a free and fair election, are either silent or agree that there was massive fraud.
What's happening in the United States, what really started the night of the election, is very shocking. And again, if you just compare the bravery of ordinary Russians with the cowardice of many leading Republicans who have gone along with this just extraordinary attempt to undermine an American election, to try to deprive Americans of their votes. I mean, some of the lawsuits in Pennsylvania and elsewhere have essentially asked courts to throw out legal ballots, to disqualify people for no reason, retrospectively. And of course, the accumulation of these lawsuits is designed to make other Americans feel there must be something wrong, right? I've even seen people say this, well, if there was nothing wrong, why would there be all these lawsuits? And the answer is the lawsuits are there to make you feel that level of suspicion, to create distrust and to create doubt. And, we started this conversation by you asking me, what are the sources of the appeal of authoritarianism in democracy? And of course, this is one of them. When people begin to feel the system is rigged, when they don't trust the voting system, when they don't believe it's fair, this is when they begin to look for political alternatives. And we now have, for the first time in our history, we have a president of the United States who is seeking to create that kind of distrust among Americans in an extraordinarily cynical way. And we have leading members of his party, very often not the lower level members. So we've seen, Republicans really step up to the plate Republican secretaries of state in Georgia, Republican officials in Arizona and elsewhere have behaved honestly and honorably, whereas we see Republican senators seeming to go along with the president's game. We've seen many of them stay silent. We've seen members of the president's cabinet who haven't said anything. Attorney General hasn't said anything. I mean, there's been no pushback from many leading Republicans, and of course that lack of pushback is part of what's contributing to this sense of doubt and distrust. And although Joe Biden will be inaugurated on the 20th of January, we may see lingering problems inside the U.S. in years to come as an important large part of the public, and maybe it's even a majority in some congressional districts, no longer has any faith in our democracy, doesn't believe in the system anymore. And you will see that having all kinds of strange effects. I mean, of course, Trump himself will try to use this group and make use of it, whether for political reasons or for legal reasons. He himself is going to be in legal jeopardy once he leaves the White House, and he may try and use his supporters as some kind of weapon in an argument about why he shouldn't be prosecuted. He may try and make money out of them. I mean, that's happening already. The Trump campaign is still raising money for its fake court cases. People are still donating money, and they may go on trying to do that. But it's going to remain a problem. This group of very distrustful Americans who think this election was stolen will be a political factor for many years.
Well, we do have the institution of our independent judiciary, which is almost to a judge, thrown the Trump lawsuits out of court, said that there's nothing to it, and that they're frivolous. I mean, even Rudy Giuliani went into the Pennsylvania court alleging fraud, and then he said, I'm not alleging fraud. He lost the case, and then he went up on appeal, and he said, I am alleging fraud. So the whole thing seems so frivolous. It's hard to believe that anyone is putting any stock in the claim that there was massive fraud and there was a rigged election.
No, your point about there still being an independent judiciary is a really, really important one. Because of course there have been fears of, given the manipulation of the system that has allowed the Republican Senate majority to appoint judges, including Supreme Court judges, even when that right ought to have belonged to a Democratic president, has led many to fear that our legal system would be corrupted as well. And of course, we haven't had a case going to the Supreme Court yet, and it doesn't look right now, as I'm speaking to you, like we will, although who knows. And we haven't had that tested yet. Many people have long hoped that, that the judges who are loyal to the Constitution and not to the party or to the president, which is as it should be. And so far, yes, the independent judiciary has proved has done very well. I mean, judges have been throwing out cases. They've been criticizing them as frivolous. They've been criticizing them as undemocratic, actually. I mean, they've pointed out that Giuliani and others are seeking to nullify, as I said, the legal votes of millions of Americans. But the fact that the cases are going on, the fact that the lawsuits are still being filed, the fact that there's still propaganda about this, the fact that hosts on Fox News are still trying to stir up trouble and doubt about voting systems and counting systems. I mean, all of that will matter, and people are affected by that. They see it and read it, and that will lead to a decline in faith in our system. The same kinds of decline and doubts about democracy that we've seen in other countries in recent years.
Should be mentioned that the Third Circuit case, which was the most stinging rebuke to Trump and his position of a massive fraud, it was a panel of 3 Republican judges, and the opinion, which was scathing in its criticism of this attack on democracy, was written by a Trump-appointed judge. So the independent judiciary, or at least the appearance of one, is alive and well in the United States.
Well, no, it's not just an appearance; it's real. I mean, they prove that they are indeed loyal to the Constitution and to the ideals of democracy, and not to a particular president or to a particular party. And that is really good news about the political system, at least in these cases about the election. How those judges will rule in other kinds of cases, we don't know. But this is a very, it's been very difficult to make a judgment about this period, because what we are watching is an American president trying to steal an election, but he's doing it in such a ham-handed and incompetent way that people haven't known whether to take it seriously or not. But I do think that the one piece of good news that we have out of this strange saga and this strange political moment is that so far the judiciary has shown that it's loyal to the country and to the Constitution, and not to a badly behaving that's insufficient, but not to an anti-democratic authoritarian president.
Is there something, Anne, basically wrong with our political system? That here, the Republican Party lost the popular vote in 7 out of the past 8 presidential elections. And the Republicans rely on the Electoral College and their bare majority in the Senate to give red states outsized influence, particularly populating the judiciary and also either blocking progressive programs or else trying to introduce their own legislation, which with regard to immigration or other issues is unpopular.
So yes, it's true that our Constitution, which was written in a different era and with different aims, has now put us in a situation where it's not really about red states, it's about rural states, whereby rural voters have 5 or 6 times as much power and influence as urban voters. 2 Senate seats to Wyoming and to Alaska, with a few 100,000 people each, and the same 2 Senate seats to California with many millions of people. But the Senate is skewed in that direction, and the Electoral College is skewed in it partly towards rural states, but more in that it's skewed to give undue influence to states where the vote is close. So every year what really matters are the people of Michigan and Ohio and Florida, and not the people of California, or New York, or for that matter, Kansas. So it's both of these systems were set up, for different sets of reasons in the 18th century. And it would seem like it's time to think about altering or changing them. I mean, the difficulty with that is that to change the Constitution of the United States does require, the kind of constitutional majority and a kind of political movement that doesn't seem likely to come about anytime soon. So
2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states. It's very unlikely that
seems very unlikely.
it would be
I mean,
achieved.
people have proposed other remedies. One of them is to think about admitting some new states, for example, the District of Columbia, which is where I grew up. And the more I've thought about it recently, the more I think that's a good idea. That Washington, D.C. has a higher population than at least 2 other states, and it's a territory with very deep roots in American history and its own culture and its own its own kind of historical development, and it would seem like a moment when that would be a fair thing to do. But again, that will just depend on the numbers in the Senate over the next several years and factors that I can't foresee. I mean, in the meantime, the main remedy for the Democratic Party is going to have to be to try and find a message that reaches rural Americans. And that is difficult, but it shouldn't be impossible. Thinking hard about who lives in rural America, what kind of media, what kind of social media can reach them, what kind of messages, focusing on reaching that constituency should be the goal of the Democratic. I mean, I suppose the other strange imbalance in our political system is that the Democratic Party, by definition, because it has to win so many more votes in order to win an election, millions more, has to be a much broader coalition. So it has to include urban people and suburban people, and it now needs to have a rural wing as well, a rural constituency, a way to reach people in Iowa or Kansas, in a better and more consistent way. And I'm hoping that's what the Biden administration will start to do or start to figure out in the coming years. And that would, of course, also begin to change the political calculus in the United States.
We might agree that the Trump administration has been an authoritarian administration, from an unfunded border wall to politicized Justice Department, other departments of the government, and accusing his enemies of treason, and the press, the free press, of being enemies of the people. But do you see Trump as having a legacy of authoritarianism, or the GOP will have accepted a legacy of authoritarianism and will continue to try to undermine the government under Biden, and give Biden really a very weak presidency, which he has been elected to carry out?
Presidents should now be obliged to reveal their tax affairs. I don't think we can have another president who doesn't do that, who doesn't tell us what his financial interests are. We also know, we know that the members of the administration broke all kinds of other rules, whether security clearances or abuse of private email, ironically, since that's what they accused Hillary Clinton of doing. And they've broken, one rule after another, and also mixing political and government business, which, again, some of these things are going to have to be made into legal norms rather than just, legal rules rather than just accepted norms. But Trump has been checked in many of his worst, in many of his, many of the things that he did that were the most illegal, and most notably, he's been checked in his attempt to steal the election. But the question, you're right, that the question remains, what is his legacy inside the party? And does the party now, the Republican Party, now see those kinds of tactics as legitimate, and are they going to continue to use them? My guess is that they will. There will be an attempt to make the Biden presidency a failed presidency, that a part of the country will never believe that Biden was legally elected, that the Republican Senate, to the extent that it can, will seek not to cooperate with the president. Biden himself, partly because he's a former senator and he has relationships with many people in the Senate, is going to try and reach out, and he is going to try and argue that for the good of the country, there needs to be, unity. He's made several speeches to that effect so far. That's part of what his campaign rhetoric was built around, the idea that there's one America, that what unites us is more important than what divides us. And actually, I think he sincerely believes this, as do many people around him. It may be that he is able to reach a few people, whether it's Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski. There are a few senators who have shown some degree of independence, or who have used that kind of more independent language in the past. And some of those are the senators who've recognized Biden's victory. Romney has already recognized Biden's victory, for example, and as have a few others. And it may be that because the numbers, however the Georgia race comes out, the numbers are going to be very close. It may be that Biden is able to work with a few key senators and pass the important legislation that we need. But is there going to be a part of the party that will go on trying to undermine Biden and go on trying to play this game of creating distrust? Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've seen Ted Cruz talk that way in the last few days. We've heard Marco Rubio talk that way. We've heard Rand Paul talk that way. So I do think that there are people who are deeply disappointed with the modern United States, who don't like what the country has become and who would like to change it drastically and even violently. There are people who don't like demographic change. There are people who don't like, religious and social change and cultural change that have happened in the last 2, 3, 4 decades, and who would like it to wrench the country in a different direction. I mean, those people are a minority. As we've discussed, the Constitution gives them an undue amount of influence through the political system, but they remain a minority. And it's my hope that over the next few years, and by clever campaigning and by trying to refocus Americans on what really matters, on our economy, on our healthcare system, and some of our badly broken political and social systems. I hope that Biden, by doing that, can begin to pull us together and loosen the appeal of this, this minority I would even describe it as an anti-American or a disappointed American minority. I would hope he could loosen their appeal, if nothing else, over the next few years.
I have a question for you. Your book really sounds a cautionary note, but you kind of end with a note of optimism. My question is, do you see authoritarianism rising again in the United States?
So the book, the book ends optimistically in part because I think it's very irresponsible to be a pessimist. History is radically open and we don't know what will happen. And it's very important that all of us act every day as if we know that, as if we know that our democracy could decline and we need to do whatever we can to prevent it.
No rules either way. So Anne Applebaum, this has been just marvelous. Thank you for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, stay safe, and all the best.